I am Maureen Benscooter from Austin, Texas, and this is my son, George Benscooter. We adopted George from South Korea when he was an infant. So we met George when he was 7 months old, just a cute little baby. And at the time of the adoption, we didn't know that he had any special needs. And over the next several years, it became clear that that he was having delays and not meeting milestones, and was eventually diagnosed with having pretty significant autism and what's called global developmental delay. So he had delays in speech and motor and fine motor, but most significantly speech. When he was 12, he choked on a flour tortilla and cut off oxygen supply to his brain, and went from being an able-bodied 12-year-old who had autism to a 12-year-old who was paralyzed from the neck down, was unable to eat anymore, lost the communication that he did have, and became a person who needs total care. It was a huge adjustment for us to go from a 12-year-old who's able-bodied and can, walk and run and feed himself, to a child who's completely dependent on us for everything. And then our physical home had to have adjustments made to it. So we knew before we left the hospital after the accident that he was going to need nursing home level of care. I described it to people as trying to run a nursing home with a staff of one. Like, would you ever put your loved one in a nursing home that only had one staff member? You would never do that. For the last 5 or 6 years, we've had about 80 hours of nursing care in the home for George. And at the beginning of the pandemic, that was still the case. So that's nurses, RNs, and LVNs coming in to provide his care, bedside care. And they went to school with him as well. As the pandemic wore on and the whole field of nursing was under such awful stress, it started to affect the private duty nursing or the home health nursing field as well. During COVID, here in Texas, we had the Snowmageddon, the big ice storm. In our home, we did not lose power, but the specter of that happening, and it was just by luck that it didn't happen to us, made us think about what would we do in those circumstances. George is dependent on several electric-powered devices, including his suction machine, the food pump that provides all of his food and water, and his hospital bed. Each of those devices has an internal battery that is charged. Each of them can run for about 4 hours without electricity. But here in Austin, people went days without electricity. So if we started doing some planning around that, one was to make sure that we were able to communicate, that we understood where to look for the information that had things like warming centers that were open, or I know in Austin they would open a school if there was a school with power specifically for people who had medical devices that needed to be charged. I have never been survivalist, but now I think about that more. How would my family survive for 4 or 5 days without water and electricity? Because it happened in the not too distant past. So I now have a go bag of emergency supplies for George. I keep bottles of water available for the whole family. I don't know if I have enough for 4 or 5 days, but I've got some. I could at least keep George hydrated if we lost water again. And then I thought long and hard about a power supply. I looked around and did some research, and our goal was not to run the refrigerator or power the whole house, but what I absolutely need to do for George is to power that bed, that suction, that food pump. I've got 3 or 4 devices I need to get power to, at least on an intermittent basis. And I found out about these lithium-ion big batteries that you can get and keep charged, and it's a little a system, and you can plug devices directly into the system. So I went to our Medicaid provider and said, George his life is dependent on having access to electricity, and we don't need a generator, which costs $4,000, but I have found this battery device for $700 that would serve our purposes. And the care coordinator I was talking to said, well, we've never had a request for one of those and we've never gotten approval. But, I asked and she talked to me and she said, well, wanted the details of how would you use it exactly? And we went back and forth several times, and then she took it to her manager and she got it approved. So if I could tell parents one thing about being ready for an emergency, it would probably be two things. And one is to have a go bag ready in case of a flood or fire and you have to evacuate quickly. The other thing that I would say is have some form of medical record available, and either on your child's wheelchair or on them somehow, or easily by the front door that you can grab, because many of us have kids who are unable to speak for themselves, so they're not going to be able to communicate with an emergency responder. And they may have complicated medical histories. They may be on multiple medications. It just can be quite complicated. And so to have a medical summary, or even like what we use is our daily log sheet that we keep by the bed, which has all of his medications and the times that we give him, and records of his daily habits and things like that, so that in an emergency, if I'm not there to tell someone, and George is unable to tell a responder, or I just don't have time to grab anything else, I can grab that and go. And it gives an emergency responder or an ER physician somewhere to start. Advice that I would give other parents is based on my experience, for instance, with getting a battery power pack, is ask. Our Medicaid providers, if you have Medicaid, our Medicaid providers may not be aware that there's a product out there that could save your child's life in the event of an emergency. And what we found was that we asked, and we had the information, and we went back and forth, and they might say yes.